My name is Jillian Roberts, and I work with the Terrain Sciences and Geoscience Data Management section of the Geological Survey of Newfoundland and Labrador. In this video, I will be discussing how sea level has changed in our province and what we can expect in the future. Joining me is Dr. Martin Batterson, a glacial geologist who has spent 30 years studying sea level change. The impact of a rising sea level and a changing climate is important to us here in Newfoundland and Labrador because we're a province married to the ocean. Over 80% of our population lives within a few kilometers of the sea. Our roads, power and phone lines commonly run close to the coast. We have a strong fishing industry with its associated infrastructure. We have generating stations, cabins, houses, trails, cemeteries, and much more, all located close to the coast. It's not hard to understand why changes to our coastline will affect many aspects of life here in Newfoundland and Labrador.
Our coastline owes its development to processes that have operated over thousands of years. 20,000 years ago, which is a blink of an eye geologically speaking, our province was completely covered by ice. When these ice sheets melted away, they left behind sediments and features that make up our coastline today. Some of these sediments were deposited under the glaciers, the compact, silty, sandy, rocky material many of us curse at while digging in our gardens. Other sediments were washed out by the glaciers as they were melting, loose, sandy or gravelly material, and some was deposited in once higher oceans, including the clay deposits we find around our coast. Since the glaciers melted, these sediments have been moved around by wind, rain, rivers and the ocean to produce the features we find along the coast today: cliffs, beaches, barochois, and sand dunes.
The coastline is constantly changing. Anyone who visits the coast regularly will see an evolving environment as a result of the interaction of waves, tides, wind and rain, and of course, people. There is, however, a slower process that will affect the coast of Newfoundland and Labrador for the foreseeable future, and that's sea level rise. Globally, there are two main causes of sea level rise. The melting of the polar ice sheets releases huge volumes of water into the oceans. Oceans are getting warmer, and this has a big impact because warm water takes up more space than cold. In Newfoundland and Labrador, there is another factor, and that has to do with the last glacial period.
During the last glacial period, ice gradually covered the entire province, achieving its maximum extent about 18,000 years ago and reaching thicknesses of more than 2 kilometers over Labrador. As ice built up over the land, it had the effect of pushing down the Earth's crust, in much the same way as loading a boat causes it to sink in the water. The crustal material under the ice sheets was pushed out towards the edges. As the ice sheets started to melt, the weight was removed from the crust and it started to readjust back towards its original state. Eventually, the crust will regain its pre-glacial condition, but we're not there yet. The water held within the ice sheets came from the oceans, which caused a significant lowering of sea level during the glacial period. Parts of the Grand Banks, for instance, were exposed during this time. The evidence for these past periods of higher or lower sea level is really everywhere around our coastline. For example, this delta, which was formed at the mouth of a river when sea level was higher. Sea stacks found on land, like this one from Labrador. Crescent-shaped beach ridges similar to these, and here at Placentia. Evidence from drill cores and echo sounders show some parts of the province experience periods of lower sea level. On the east coast, St. John's Harbour, for instance, was once a freshwater pond. The global evidence of sea level rise comes from satellites, which continually measure the surface elevation of the oceans, and from tide gauges. Not all areas are changing at the same pace. In some parts of the globe, sea level is actually falling. Newfoundland and Labrador is not one of these areas. In our province, the story is of rising sea level. From what we know, sea level is rising faster in eastern Newfoundland than on the west coast. Areas of northern Labrador will likely have the smallest amount of sea level rise during this century, because these areas are closer to the center of the old ice sheets. Even here, though, sea level will likely rise by the end of the century. It's difficult to be precise in terms of amounts, But up to a metre rise in eastern Newfoundland is not unreasonable, compared to 70 to 90 centimetres on the west coast, and somewhat less in northern Labrador.
In this video, we have discussed sea level change in Newfoundland and Labrador and what we can expect in the future. In the next video, we'll talk about how and why our coastline is changing and the potential consequences for our province.